I'd like to introduce Anurag Gupta. We were at Cambridge together almost a decade ago, and the one thing that always defined him was his passion and his commitment to social causes. He was always working on various issues, and his trajectory shows that, because eventually, after doing a degree in law, getting the bar, he decided to quit all that because the sense of justice and the idea of justice was very strong for him always. And he decided to work towards reducing discrimination in society, which is a very long battle, given how deep-rooted sensitivities are and biases are. But I can say this, that he's in it for the long haul. So, over to Anurag.
Great, thank you so much. Really thrilled to hear. This was not planned. It was very last minute, so I'm grateful that you're giving me the time and your ears to listen to what I'm up to. I guess before we begin, I'd love to just share with you, I'm all right, a little bit about our work, so I'll just play this link. All right, so this is a 2.5 minute video. I'll give you an overview of that over the course of my presentation. Well, basically, what we're really talking about is this idea of breaking bias, right? Specifically, unconscious bias, implicit bias. How many of you are familiar with this idea of implicit bias or unconscious bias? A few of you. Oh, that's great. Wonderful. So, basically, we're living in a really interesting times right now, as you could see, globally. I'm from the US, so I mostly know about the American context, but there's a very disconcerting kind of rise of bigotry and xenophobia that, arguably has existed everywhere and has been kind of underlining a lot of national geopolitical movements. But now a lot of that rhetoric is kind of part of the public discourse. In the US, it's very present with the current presidential elections among various civil society groups to politicians themselves. But we can see similar types of rhetoric kind of arising in Europe. For example, Brexit was very much a product of xenophobia and bigotry, as well as what's happening in Western Europe, from Germany to France to even Australia, New Zealand, and other places. And a lot of that rhetoric is really targeting minorities. In America, we call them people of color, so folks that are non-white. In other countries, it's something else. And arguably, this is also very much a part of societies that are beyond the West, Islamic nations and other places. I'll focus solely on the US because that's what I know most about, but I'd love to kind of hear your perspectives on how this may be relevant to you and your research. But before I guess, delve into the work itself and what we do and how we hack unconscious bias and how we're breaking bias, I'd like to start with why me? Why is this Indian-looking man from the US doing this work, right? So my background is very much in the sciences. I studied biology and chemistry, and I was very much fascinated with the idea of human genomes. So 16 years ago, the Human Genome Project mapped the entire sequence of the human DNA. This was done in the US. It was like a 15-year process. It had been in the works for a very long time. And one of the things that they found was that there's no gene for race. This idea of race that is so pervasive, at least in the West, in the United States, but there's no gene for it. What that means is that people that are identified in different racial categories are no different at the genetic level, at the biological level, at all. All human beings are 99.9% identical. That's what makes us a species, right? We're the same exact species. And for me, that's really fascinating because what the research really showed was that the vast majority of genetic diversity that exists is within what we call racial categories. So for example, 85% of human diversity, genetic diversity, actually exists in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are people that we categorize as black, right, or African, but actually genetically they're probably more different from one another. And what the research also showed was that people that are put in different racial categories can be more identical genetically than people in the same racial categories. What that means is that a Russian and an Indian may be more similar genetically than an Indian and an Indian, or a Russian and a Russian. So this is kind of mind-blowing in terms of human development, because we're kind of conditioned and framed to really see one another and perceive one another based on our appearance, right? And really think about one another as different. But when it comes to kind of our genetic code, we're actually not. So that's incredible and awesome. And yes, there's only one human race. But then for me personally, the fact is that having been raised in the US and having lived there, particularly in light of 9/11, I would still have people call me a terrorist to my face, or call me Osama bin Laden. A few years ago, I was going to my doctor's office, and a patient expressed concern that she was concerned that there was a strange and suspicious character in the waiting room. And of course, it was directed towards me. So regardless of my education, regardless of the awards that I have, and whatever I may be, right, these types of incidents are quite common that happen on a daily basis that could really, in 1 second, really delegitimize and dehumanize a person and kind of have all sorts of personal and professional effects on one's life. And that's kind of what I really felt was happening to me, that it doesn't matter how much I accomplish, it doesn't matter how many awards I get or degrees I get, I was still looked upon as an other. And that affected the way people saw me, as well as thought about my competencies and my abilities as a professional, particularly in the United States. So this was like one thing that I was kind of constantly battling in my professional career. But simultaneously, I also noticed that, well, on the one hand, there's no gene for race, in the United States at least. There are massive disparities when it comes to indicators of human development across what are racial lines. So broadly speaking, in America, there are 5 racial categories, like the way we collect our data. One is, of course, white, and then black, Latino, which is basically people with any sort of Spanish ancestry, and most of Latino folks are mixed from South and Central America and the Caribbean. Then you have Asians, so Asian Americans, which basically includes the entire continent of Asia, so anywhere from Japan to Sri Lanka, to arguably Afghanistan and Iran. And then you have Native Americans, which are the indigenous peoples of the United States. And when it comes to like social and economic indicators, from health to the justice system to education and wealth, there's massive disparities. So here, for example, when it comes to cancer rates, so rates of asthma, they're more often like twice as much among black and brown populations than white populations. Black folks are sentenced on average 18 months longer than white folks for committing the same exact crimes. Education access, 1 in 2 children of color attend, very under-resourced schools compared to 1 in 11 white children. In the wealth gap, 96.1% of the 1%. So I'm sure you're familiar with the 1% and the idea of Occupy Wall Street. But 96% of it is white. Now, this is in context of 40% of the United States currently is non-white. So that's a huge number, right? And then there's a massive issue of disparity when it comes to distribution of wealth and resources. So while I'm also on the one hand very privileged, right, educated, and all of that, I'm also aware of why are these disparities existing across the board? What is the cause of it, particularly when it comes to this racial categorization? And that's kind of what began my quest, was to really understand the causes of these disparities. I'm not sure how often it is in India and other contexts, but in America, oftentimes the reasons that are given for racial disparities is because, well, those people are not smart, they're genetically deficient, or there's something wrong with their culture, which is why they are poor, or they're undereducated, or commit more crime, you name it, right? And these types of I would say stereotypes, but then also these stories are really pervasive in the media, and oftentimes also kind of are used by academics as justifications for policies that are made at a national level. So in the US, we have all sorts of social policies that is informed by these belief systems about entire categories of people. For me, in the background, it's like, oh my gosh, like race doesn't exist, right? There's no genetic basis for it. So what's really causing it? So that's kind of what began this quest. And after law school, I started working with a think tank called the Vera Institute of Justice. And that's where I really kind of took on this question of what are the root causes of race-based disparities in the United States? And one of the kind of the pervasive reason that's given is racism, right? But what is racism? And oftentimes racism is conflated between, individual interpersonal racism and structural racism. And that itself has a lot of, I would say, analytical undertones around what it is. And for me, I was like, well, how do we really create solutions to these problems? Like, how do we address disparities? Like, what do we have to do in order to get there? And that's kind of where I really began I began reading into a lot of the leading neuroscience research and research in social psychology, which really starts with this particular rule, which I love. It's called the Hebb's rule, neurons that fire together, wire together. And basically what it means is that we as human beings are social animals, right? We are products of our conditioning. And despite the fact that, we know all the research behind why social inequity exists in our country, in the US, because academics have kind of done all the heavy lifting around it. At the end of the day, people that are making decisions are themselves human beings, and they're products of their social conditioning. And this really kind of is what is the pinnacle of why we have a lot of disparities when it comes to interpersonal exchanges, discrimination. And for me, this really kind of begs the question around what about our conditioning is really informing our decisions and our behavior in different contexts. And when you think about a relationship between a police officer and a civilian, or a doctor and a patient, a teacher and a student, there's something happening in that interaction where a teacher is preferring one student over another, or a police officer is behaving in a certain way than he is or she is with another person. And that's really a product of how we're associating certain physical features of a human being with other people, and then also how that's a product of our own conditioning, basically our families, the media we watch, the books we've read, and how these social cues have really created ideas that we have about one another. And that's what's kind of really took me on this quest of implicit bias and unconscious bias. So in the last 20 years, what's been really exciting is that scientists have kind of done all the heavy lifting around understanding the causes of discrimination. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the implicit association test. It's called the IAT. So it's basically what you see on the left. And there's different kinds of IATs. There's a race IAT and the gender IAT. And it's a really quick 2-minute test. It's like a matching game where you're asked to kind of type rapidly or press rapidly either E or an I, and it measures your implicit associations or your unconscious associations, positive or negative. So our brains, again, at the end of the day, as we've evolved from reptilian brains to modern day brains, we have so much stored information, which is a product of, again, our conditioning. So it tells us how, what kinds of preferences or associations we have based on certain visual cues. And the IAT measures one's implicit associations. And what they've found in the last 20 years, it's been about over 11 million sample points, that 75% of Americans have an automatic white preference when it comes to unconscious associations. What that means is that they associate positive words with people that appear white, and also negative words with people that appear black, with darker skin. And this includes people of color. So this includes black folks themselves. 55% of black folks in America have an automatic white preference. So it's kind of across the board. And once we know that this exists and we can measure it, as you'll see on the map of the US, This is the mean IIT score of white participants in different American states. So the blue, the blue ranges is kind of moderate preference, slight to moderate preference of white people, and the reds are moderate to strong preference of white people, as you can measure on that. So, and this is again a huge sample size of participants, and it's self-selected. So the real thing is probably worse than what we see here. But the point really is that the vast majority of Americans have an automatic white preference. So these can be politicians, it could be police officers, it could be doctors, it could be, you name it, everyday consumer. But if that's a chip in our head that we have, that's really informing the way we interact with people. So let's do this. Yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. So like when you said...
do you want to turn on the mic?
So when you say the association of positive words or negative words with either white people or black people, are these, what do you mean by that? Words or phrases or ideas? Could you give an example of
Totally.
How a positive association with a white person and a negative one with a black person would be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you a little bit about the test, right? So basically what happens is it's a black screen, and they're kind of flashing different words, positive words and negative words, good, bad, diamond, cockroach, whatever, positive and negative things that come up, right? And you have to hit E for positive words and I for negative words that you see. And simultaneously, they're also mixing in pictures of white people and black people. And then they'll assign you, for white people, hit E, and for black people, hit I. And it's about 5 different tests. And it's basically, if you're too slow at doing this, if you're thinking too much, the test stops and you have to start over. So what they're measuring on the back end is the amount of lag time it takes you when white people and positive words are in the same categories, and then black people and positive words are in the same category. And what they found is when they're in the same category, our brain is taking a little bit longer time to make that association. And it's easier for people to make those associations together when it's a white person. I would really recommend you all take it. It's easy. Project Implicit, it's a Harvard-based site. It came out in 1994, and they have over 11 million sample points just in the US. And it's really kind of changed the way research is done on inequality in the US, because there have been over 1,000 studies on this from across disciplines, criminology to employment to education. And they've found that implicit bias is a cause for inequality and differential treatment beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But yes, you had a question.
It's very good. So this scale actually measures both the reluctance of white participants to group white people into negative categories or negative words, as well as the reluctance to put black people into positive words.
Well, so it's
is this the timeline that we're measuring here?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And it's not a reluctance. It's unconscious. So it's not conscious. It's not that white people are consciously putting black people in negative words. And it's not, this particular map only shows the scores of white participants. But as I said, a majority of Americans, regardless of color, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Black Americans, have an automatic white preference. And this goes back to the earlier statement I made that, this is because as human beings, our brains are a product of the social cues we receive from a very young age. So if we continue to see certain positive images of certain people, let's say in the movies, in the media we watch, in the books we read, and we don't have those similarly situated representations of people that don't look white, then our brain is kind of wired to see white people as heroes, as actors, as the protagonists, and other people as villains, which is kind of what we see in Hollywood, continue to see to this day. So that's kind of what this is basically showing. Something that's like such common sense on the one hand, but we need a lot of research to prove for policymakers, right? Pretty much. Okay, so let's do this together. A father and his son are in a car accident. The father dies at the scene, and the son, badly injured, is rushed to the hospital. In the operating room, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I cannot operate on this boy. He is my son." How could this be? If people didn't hear that. Well, but maybe you should pause, right? Because I guess most of you heard this, right?
Yeah.
Have you heard this before? Yes. So, what was your first instinct when you? And if you have heard this riddle, then you probably knew what the answer is. But what was your first instinct when you read this or heard this? I'm sorry? Pause. Right. It took a while. It's like, well, how could this be? Right, what's the deal here? And then what is this riddle really showing?
I think doctors usually associate like the male gender.
Right.
That's what.
Gender identity, how we automatically assume like a firefighter would not be a leader, possibly. Like
Right.
there was a recent news in Egypt where there was a fire.
You turn on the mic.
A person died, and I would have thought that would have been a guy.
Right.
Until the picture appeared, and it wasn't that. But it could have been a woman.
And the key word here is surgeon, right? So it's really interesting. Like, how do we? If someone just said the word surgeon, like, what is the first image that comes to our brains and minds, right? What is the gender identity of that person? Surgeon. And we've done this with so many people. Like, I've trained many people, and then this actually has been around for about 20 years. It was a part of Reader's Digest in like mid 80s, and about 82% of all people, regardless of gender, come up with all sorts of concoctions of, well, it could be a gay couple, right? It could be two fathers, or the father is actually a Catholic priest because the capital F, right? My mother, who's a surgeon herself, had come up with a ghost story that the father had returned to protect his son rather. So again, the automatic, association between surgeon and male is so strong that the alternative is really difficult. But the cool thing is, the second right, oh, it could be a woman, right, easily, right, 99% of all couples are heterosexual and male and female, then you're just like, oh, whoa, of course. And then once you make the unconscious conscious, you can actually rewire the brain. And it's really quick and automatic. So I want to use another similar image. So these are images from a natural catastrophe. I don't know if any of you can guess where these images are from in the U.S. I'm sorry?
Katrina?
Yes.
Katrina.
Yes, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So what are these people doing? Yes, trying to come out of the water. And this is how they were being reported in the media in the U.S. The top image says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And the bottom image, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. So the top person has become a looter, and the bottom 2 are finders. In a natural catastrophe, how does one become a finder when everything is underwater? And there could be a more neutral way of describing all of these people, that they took, right, stuff by taking. But the automatic association between a black person and stuff is looting, and white people as finding, right? And now these are Associated Press, right? It's the AFP. These are syndicated news distributors. So this is being translated into French, into Spanish, into Hindi, into Japanese, you name it. And then this association is being carried across societies. But then going back to the Human Genome Project, there's actually no difference between these human beings, at the genetic level, the biological level. Of course, socially, they're very different. But this is, again, shifting people's beliefs and perceptions and then behaviors towards these classes of people, purely based on their physical appearance. So the good news really is this idea of neuroplasticity. I don't know if you've heard of this idea, but it's our ability to rewire the brain using different social cues, environmental cues, and practices. So if we're wired for bias, right, which oftentimes isn't our fault, it's because of the social cues that we've received from our society, the media we watch, the families we grow up in. That's okay. The cool thing is we have to make all those unconscious associations conscious and then rewire our brains to really break bias. And that's pretty much my work, right? We've come up with this toolkit called PRISM, and PRISM is an acronym that stands for these 5 different strategies that have been tested in the lab, by neuroscientists and social psychologists to show a reduction in bias based on the implicit association test. And we use these techniques to really train different sorts of people to shift their perceptions, their beliefs, and eventually their behaviors when it comes to interactions as well as making decisions. So the way we do this at Be More America is through in-person trainings, in-person workshops. So I've trained over 500 people, and to provide you with some context, it's a startup. Be More, like my company, is very much a startup. We've been around for 2.5 years, and really kind of just testing different things. For us, it began as like a quest as to, well, if we know all the reasons and causes of social ills, of social inequality in our country and the world, why aren't we creating solutions? But the cool thing is, scientists have also created those solutions. All of these strategies, perspective taking, pro-social behaviors, stereotype replacement, etc. These are all solutions that have been tested, but they're just sitting in academic texts, kind of collecting dust. So for us, it was like, well, can we apply this and actually bring it to people who can influence and change these conditions at a societal level? So we've done trainings in person with, in corporate settings, in hospitals, in schools, in nonprofits, and civil society organizations. And what we've learned is that people really want to learn how to break bias. What's happened is, particularly in the U.S. context, is anytime we talk about issues of difference and diversity, there's a certain level of stress that very quickly enters the room. People don't know what to say. They're constantly walking on eggshells. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And what we've done is that, hey, it's okay. There's actually scholars out there that study guilt, like the human emotion of guilt and the human emotion of shame. So if that's coming up, that's perfectly normal in your human body. So there's no judgment in the room, which actually allows people to learn and then shift, their behaviors in different settings. So we've been doing that, but our goal really is to develop an online training. So workshops are a one-time thing. Now I know, yes, there's no gene for race. Yes, race is a story. This is how it was created, et cetera, et cetera. These are the implications of these disparities. But then what we really need to do is train the mind. Neuroplasticity, we have to give people specific strategies to rewire the brain, and that's practice over time. So that's what we're developing right now. It's an online training that hacks unconscious bias, and the idea of this training is that it'll be distributed over several weeks. Weekly modules, half an hour, 45 minutes, not very long, but specifically tailored towards different professionals. And we're starting with doctors. And doctors, because it's been shown that in the US, unconscious bias is one of the major causes of differential health treatment. So, for example, darker skinned patients receive lower dosages of pain medication than, white folks. And it's not because doctors are consciously biased or racist, but it's because there's an unconscious belief that black skin can take higher thresholds of pain. And this goes back to in the era of colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, right? But that's an unconscious belief. That's very much cultural, but it could be rewired, right? Once we're like, oh shit, that sounds silly. I can't believe I believe that. But once they can make that conscious, then they can actually shift their behavior. So the goal is to really, introduce these PRISM strategies on a daily basis to help people really shift their behavior over time. And at this point, we're really targeting shifting beliefs and perceptions by doing a lot of pre-post testing with our training. And then eventually we'll need to do more longitudinal studies around shifting behavior, like what's their behavior before the training and then after the training, to really show like a measurable shift in both their personal well-being, but then also how they use their professional judgment and the type of care they provide. It's very relevant to what's happening, at least in the US, in our policing systems. I'm sure you're aware of the news cycle that's constantly showing a lot of unarmed African Americans being shot by the police. One case after another, more ridiculous, more insane. The last one was this guy with his hands up, "Don't shoot me," and the police officer actually shoots him. And the guy is like, "Why did you shoot me?" And the police officer is like, "I don't know, but I just shot you." And it's just getting to a point, it's like, what's going on in the body? And again, it's this fear, the sense of fear that arises. Again, it's unconscious, but once the body is caught in fear, because of all sorts of associations around black bodies and black faces, being criminals and looters, you name it, the body is like, I have to save myself, and therefore I can shoot to kill. So there's a historical pattern on dehumanization of certain people, which then leads to certain actions towards them. And it's most present in people with decision-making power, which is why, the way we're doing our work is really targeting professionals. We're starting in the healthcare industry, targeting doctors when it comes to our online training, but then also thinking about other professionals, nurses, teachers, police officers, lawyers, judges. I mentioned the statistic that black people are sentenced on average 18 months longer than white people for committing the same exact crime. So what's going on there? There's a huge sentencing disparity. Same thing when it comes to receiving pain dosages or suspension rates for students. Black students are suspended at a 5 times higher rate than white students. And I'm sure it's also similar for other students of color, but we just don't have the research for those demographics. And then all of the work that we're doing is very much informed by research. So before founding Be More, I went on this national tour of talking to like 2,000 academics. So I've spoken to kind of the founders of the Implicit Association tests, Tony Greenwald, Mahazrin Banerjee, Brian Nosek. A lot of these folks are on our advisory board. They're expert consultants. And the goal really is because we want to create these solutions in collaboration with researchers. A lot of times what happens in area of social innovation and social change is people, again, follow their emotions and they're like, well, I think this is what's best for those people because that's the right thing to do, but it's not informed by research, it's not informed by evidence, and oftentimes it creates more damage than helping folks. I'm not sure if you know about Brian Stevenson, but I'd really recommend you watch his TED Talk. He's one of the most premier kind of human rights activists in the country. He was my professor of law when I was in law school, and he really talks about these ideas of reconciliation and healing using kind of massive shifts in the justice system. And he's pretty much working on issues of death penalty, but he's one of our expert advisors as well. So it's really influenced by academics and social activists, and we're really trying to combine different disciplines and bring it into kind of one framework to then create solutions. So that's pretty much it. I just wanted to kind of give an overview of how breaking bias happens and how we're hacking unconscious bias, particularly in light of all that's happening in the US, but then also how this could be applicable in different countries. And of course, we're starting with this identity of race, but eventually moving to other social identities, whether it's gender or gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, you name it. It could be applied across those boards, but we're starting small because we're small.